live now? Oh. Good afternoon. How are you all doing? I'd like to welcome you to the 15th panel in our series of Yale career panels, a candid view. My name is Trish Takamoto, and I'm the New York chapter president of AYA, which is the Association of Asian American Yale Alumni, and we're one of the co-sponsors of this event. We'd like to thank the other co-sponsors, the Yale Office of Career Strategy, the Association of Yale Alumni, the Yale School of Management, the Students and Alumni of Yale, the Junior Class Council, the Asian American Cultural Center, and the AYA New Haven chapter, and the Yale Alumni Association of New York. By the way, when I say we'd like to thank them all, I'd like to acknowledge Peter Young, who, class of 74, who is actually the person who conceived this series and organizes it with help by me. These panels are dedicated to giving you a frank and unvarnished look at the various professions. And of course, though, the starting point for all of you in exploring your career options is to candidly and honestly evaluate yourself, your strengths and your weaknesses, and what your interests are. So we hope that these panels are helpful in choosing a career or careers for yourselves. Now it is my pleasure to introduce the panelists. Immediately to my left is John Levin, who works at the Fed in the New York office. Next to him is Anna Eskrogima. She's a Foreign Service officer, and many of you may have seen her already. She's been on campus before. And next to her is Sam Hussain, who's an Eli Whitney Scholar here at Yale. So I'd like to just start by having you each give a brief description of what you do now. John?
Thank you very much. It's really a pleasure to be here. It's so much fun to be back at Yale, and it's an honor to be here with these great panelists. And thank you, Trish, and thank you, Peter. My name is John Levin. I graduated from Yale in 2004 with a degree in economics. And after that, I worked for 7 years as a financial consultant to city and state governments. I worked for a private company that gave financial advice to municipal bond issuers, which included large cities and states on transactions to help finance infrastructure. After that, I went to business school at Columbia, got an MBA, and that was because I decided it was time to broaden my skill set and take my career in a slightly different path. But I did love financial analysis with a focus on policymaking, so I went to work in the markets group of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York.
So my name is Anna Eskrogima, and I am currently based in New York City in City College in Harlem as the State Department's diplomat in residence. I am one of 16 Foreign Service officers who are based on these campuses to essentially serve as a resource for students, professional associations, faculty, staff, anyone and everyone who is interested in a career with the State Department. That's Foreign Service or civil service, generalists or specialists. I am a U.S. diplomat. I've been with the State Department for 11 years. I've served primarily in the Middle East, so Tunisia, Syria, Iraq, and Dubai. And then most recently, various and sundry policy jobs in Washington, D.C. From 2010 to 2014. So being in New York is a great homecoming for me because I'm originally from New York City. So it's sort of a great way to come full circle and sort of marry, where I'm from with my passion for foreign policy and for this work.
Good afternoon. My name is Sam Hussain. I am currently a Eli Whitney Scholar here at Yale College. Prior to Yale, I was working as a consultant with Department of Defense and the Special Operations community, and also the intelligence community, having traveled in multiple hotspots areas around the world. I'm here to answer any questions and help you guys out to navigate the Washington, D.C. Bureaucracy in a way. And but currently, I'm enjoying my time here at Yale. I know you guys miss it, but I'm having a great time and looking forward to discussing anything you guys may have.
Oh, good. Okay. So we'll get to the first question, and which is, where is the profession heading, both good and bad? So, John, why don't you start?
So first of all, I have to say before I speak about my job that the views I express are my own and may not necessarily reflect those of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York or the Federal Reserve System. But to provide a little more detail on what I do, I'm in the markets group of the New York Fed, which is the wing of the Federal Reserve System that is responsible for implementing monetary policy. So the New York Fed has a trading desk that conducts open market operations to set control interest rates and conduct open market operations in accordance with the directives that are set by the Federal Reserve Board, chaired by Janet Yellen. And within that group, specifically, I'm a trader and analyst in the mortgage-backed securities market. So after the financial crisis, the Fed implemented a mortgage-backed securities purchase program, and I'm responsible for conducting the purchase of those bonds in the open market. And I also analyze fixed income and currency and equity markets globally and brief the staff at the Federal Reserve Board in Washington and the US Treasury on what are developments in financial markets and what are financial conditions doing that they need to be aware of in Washington. So where's the industry going? Well, it's a really exciting and dynamic time to be working at the Fed in the aftermath of a major financial crisis and going forward to a point where the US economy has been gradually improving. It's really a fascinating time for me to be a part of it, and it's, I think, an excellent opportunity for anyone who's graduating from college who wants to come into financial policy making at a really interesting time. A lot of participants in the financial markets are focused on when and how the Fed may normalize policy coming out of the prior extraordinary times after the financial crisis. So I think it's a great opportunity to get involved. I'm glad to have been joining in the past year and a half.
Yeah.
I guess, where is the profession going? As the nature of diplomacy and conflict evolves, I think that foreign service officers, the mandate of what the State Department is sort of being asked to take on, it keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, which is why the first thing that I say in all of my career presentations is we are looking for a diverse range of folks with diverse backgrounds, because U.S. foreign policy gets into everything from, serving in conflict zones to working on the environment, health issues, gender issues. And so, expanding mandate also means sort of the need for additional resources and people, et cetera. So I think what I would say is that the business of diplomacy is growing in many different directions. So we need all kinds of people signing up, and I encourage people to sort of not, depending on your background. I often have, for example, med students or folks with a science background asking me would I be a good fit for the Foreign Service? And I say absolutely, because we're looking for people who can write and communicate well and solve problems and are flexible. So I would say, if you ask me where the profession's going, I think it's going in lots of interesting new directions, and I think that's a good thing.
I mean, Anna's absolutely correct. As far as the DoD is concerned, there are contingency worldwide operations happening at this minute right now. And the Pentagon is looking for the same type of talent and characteristics of individuals. But the utmost concern and the priority that the DoD is looking for is languages. They are looking for individuals with native fluency. And I know Yale College has an excellent language programs. I mean, everyone is required to have languages, and that is a huge discriminator when you're applying for positions within DoD or state, and even in the intelligence community from NSA and Central Intelligence. But as far as where it's going, there are threats that are out there. Some of them are in the news, some of them are not in the news. And the Department of Defense is looking at civilian analysts, foreign language experts, cultural experts, religious experts, to really craft the policy on how to counter these threats. So it will be interesting to see how things shape out in the next 10, 12 years, but DoD is always looking for individuals that can really help craft a really precise policy.
I wanted to ask, all of you work for the federal government, so, and all of this is good, and you're all saying things are expanding, but is the expansion, doesn't it necessarily be dictated by what the budget is and where the dollars are allocated?
I have a bit of a unique take on that, which is that actually this may be something we could talk about later in our myths and misconceptions section, but the Federal Reserve is independent within government and is not financed by appropriations or fiscal decisions by Congress and the President. So our budget is not set by the budget process. So I think that's a differentiator between my role and my other two fellow panelists. So while financial conditions may dictate how much staffing the Fed needs, depending on emergency and policies that may need to take place, we don't depend on the budgetary process.
But
Yes, I mean, the fiscal picture for the State Department is very different from the fiscal picture of the Department of Defense, obviously. Just if anybody wants to venture a guess, how many United States diplomats do you think that there are? Just by way of, just to give you some parameters, we have over 250 embassies and consulates overseas that need to be staffed by Foreign Service officers, but the entire diplomatic corps of the United States is actually smaller than all the personnel in the Department of Defense or in the Army's band. So just who wants to guess? Who can guess? Anybody in the room? Just ballpark, anybody?
10,000.
I wish. It's a little bit higher, but close. Anyone else? Come on, guys.
12,000.
12,000? So that's even more. We're actually 8,000. So we have 8,000 Foreign Service officers, but no shortage of diplomatic crises around the world. So yes, mandate is expanding, and so it means that individual officers are definitely being called on to do a lot. So
a lot more.
A lot more.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, there is, over the last few years, the sequestration that is happening in Washington, especially within the DoD, where we're becoming a very lean, efficient, just because of the drawdown in Iraq and expected pullout in Afghanistan in 2017. But I think the training missions will still continue in other places. Now we're seeing threats emerge from Iraq and Syria, of course, with ISIS, and Africa. Africa will be the next hotspot in a way where United States, especially the defense analysts, are looking at with very growing concern. You have some of these failed states that are, in a way, are pre-2001 Afghanistan-like scenarios that are taking place in that region. So, and going back to languages, there are these niche languages like Twi and Ga, which are very, very specific languages. However, the educational parameters that are being implemented within DoD, just a few years ago, they invested heavily, about $200 million, to train individuals, DoD civilians and military personnel, in these target languages. Mm-hmm. So hopefully that can help us prepare for things in the future. But I agree. I mean, who knows what's going to happen with the budgetary, with the Republican budget happening in the next this Congress or the next Congress. So time will tell. Yep.
So the next question is, how do you get into the profession, and what is the typical career path? And Sam, I think I'd like you to start, since you have an interesting story.
Sure. The typical path is from college, in my opinion. And it's reaching out to the Office of Career Strategy and engaging with them early on. I like to tell my friends that, hey, sophomore year, engage with them in a way that at least you have an idea of what to do by the time you're graduating. If you are interested in Washington, D.C., get those internships early on so you're getting that D.C. experience by the time you're done with school. But at the same time, individuals interested at the Central Intelligence or DoD or NSA, apply for their summer internships. And with, like everything with federal government, deadlines are key. And but at the same time, Yale provides so many individuals with so much experience, such as Ambassador Negroponte, who's on campus, all these individuals that are here, make relationships with them. I think that's very important. Crafting those relationships, building those relationships that can help out in the future. Because in DC, a lot of what's very important is the networking element and really building those relationships. But a typical path would be to apply as an analyst position. Many individuals apply at Central Intelligence. A lot of people sometimes forget about the tiny agencies that are out there, such as NGA and the NSAs.
What's NGA?
The National Geospatial Agency.
Okay.
So these are agencies that have their own budgets, of course, but they're looking for specific skill sets, and it's a really great way to get inside the door, the federal door, in a way. So it's my advice is to start early in navigating those paths.
Anna?
So for federal government, if folks don't have a USA Jobs account open and set up and ready to go, highly recommend that you do so. Or if you haven't checked on your USA Jobs account in a while, recommend, if you're looking toward a job in the future, going back there and using the search engine to sort of look up jobs for example, so with an undergrad degree, you could be looking at jobs from a GS7 to a GS8, and with a master's degree, jobs at a GS9. So a typical path in for the State Department, Foreign Service is starting by taking the Foreign Service exam. The next one is being offered in June, and registration opens for the Foreign Service exam about a month and a half before. So we would be looking at mid to late April. We have a pretty awesome careers website, careers.state.gov. It was ranked #1 in the federal government, so a little point of pride for us. And so it's pretty user-friendly. We also have a function on that website called Keep Me Informed, where you can sort of click on the various sort of heads up you would like, whether that's on a vacancy opening or one of our fellowships. So to go back in terms of the way in, you take the written exam. If you pass that, you would get a message from us a few weeks later letting you know that you've passed, and then inviting you to submit responses to essay questions, and that is the qualitative evaluations panel phase. If you pass through that phase, then you are invited to come to Washington, D.C. for an oral assessment. If you pass the oral assessment, then you go through medical and security clearances and are placed on a register, and we pull from that register, which is sort of ranked based on the score that you got, to populate incoming classes. If you speak a difficult language, as Sam was saying, that bumps you up on the register. Also, there are other categories, like for example, veterans as well get points at that phase as well. We also, though, there are a number of fellowships. So for folks who are undergrads, there's the Pickering Fellowship and the Wrangell Fellowship, which provide funding for graduate school and then a position in the Foreign Service after graduation. So that's something to think about for graduate school. And then if you're looking more on the domestic side, on the civil service side, for folks who are planning on going to graduate school, there is the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, which is not a State Department program. It's actually a federal government-wide program. And so it actually gives you the opportunity to rotate within 3 different federal agencies. But you have, if you're selected into the program, you compete for positions with a home agency, and sort of that's your home. And then from that home, you transition for two rotations in other federal agencies. And then after you complete your 2 years, if it's a good fit between you and your home agency, you then are offered a sort of full-time civil service position. So that's a great way to get your foot in the door in the federal government as well.
This sounds like a very long and involved process for these
It is.
applications.
Persistence is key. Persistence is key. Absolutely. It's the federal government, sort of large, bureaucracy involved, which is why I think, I really encourage people to look at these fellowships as a really important, opportunity to kind of get in.
Get your foot in the door.
Get your foot in the door, so to speak. Yeah.
How was it at the Fed? Were you
So,
more difficult? Or
So I would say that the Fed application and job search process is very competitive, but it contrasts a bit with what Sam and Anna described, because since the Fed is not a federal agency, as I said, the process is a little bit more akin to what you'd experience in a private sector finance or consulting job search. So the Fed would do on-campus recruiting, and I got my job through on-campus recruiting at Columbia Business School. But for all of you in the audience who are undergrads currently, you would have an analogous process of on-campus recruiting at Yale, and it would likely be available at the on-campus career services webpage or with events through career counseling.
So after a college degree can get you a job at the Fed?
Yes, it would be an analyst role, which in some ways would be analogous to analyst roles that you might find in other private sector entities. My role is an associate role, which is a postgraduate degree kind of career, which is analogous to what you'd see in the private sector. So the best way to get a job, either out of college or out of a master's degree, is to intern at the Fed. It's not the only way, but it's probably the easiest way. And so the internship process is competitive. It would involve sending a resume and cover letter through an online application system, and then it would involve several rounds of interviews. There's no official exam like what Anna described. There's not the same federal personnel management process, but you would have a set of interviews which would really focus on making sure you're a good match with the Fed in terms of having a strong analytical skill set, a strong interest in economics and finance, and an understanding of what monetary policy is, what's going on in financial markets, and an interest in commitment to policy. So there are several analyst programs that the Fed has. One of them, which is in my group, is a rotational analyst program in markets, where an analyst would be assigned to a specialty financial market. It could be treasury bonds, money markets, equities, etc. And they would rotate over a 2-year period across 2 of those. And they would support people like myself in data analysis, presentation making, and other research projects. There's also a program for people who are really more committed to going to economics or finance PhD programs, and they have a research analyst track in the research department where you would be a research assistant to an economist doing work that's very similar to what you would do if you were to work for a Yale professor over a summer.
So can you get far with just a BA, or do you have to get an MBA eventually if you want to progress further in the Fed?
There are opportunities to stay on and get promoted if there are openings, and if you interview internally and get promoted. I would say that most people have a master's degree either in business, in public policy, or law, or a PhD in finance or economics. Many people have MBAs and masters in public policy in my department, and that's probably the easiest way to work in the open market operations desk in the markets group. So I would say it helps you based on both the skills you learn in class, the network you build. It can only help you, and I would encourage a master's degree.
Immediately or working?
Oh, working first.
Okay.
Yeah, I think it's very beneficial to work. I think it's almost impossible to get into a top MBA program without about 3 years or more of work experience. And master's in public policy or public administration, probably similar. But you would want to work somewhere else for 3 years, either in government or in finance or policy or any related field, and transition into the Fed if you got a master's afterward, if you didn't go straight to the Fed. But you could go straight into the Fed if you applied through the on-campus system and got hired.
And for your jobs, would you recommend directly out of college, or is really getting a higher degree a better idea?
Well, I agree, that having that work experience, 2 to 3 years, and then going back for your master's degree, it's very important, because that keeps you involved with your career, and once again, establishing that network.
No, okay.
That's very much important, because after you're done with grad school, you really want to jump back into the field right away without any difficulty in finding a job. And one other aspect of getting inside working with, especially the DoD or even with state, is working in the private sector, where there are so many numerous companies down in Washington where they're contracting with State Department, and especially in overseas environments, and with the DoD, and obtaining that clearance that you need, which is crucial. And clearances are very important, especially in DC, and it takes a long time. Some graduates or they kind of get put off by the clearance process because it takes such a long time, 9 to 12 months, and there's always a backlog in some way or another. But Anna's absolutely right. Persistence is the key, and patience also, because you have to remain patient, because the federal government and the clearance process takes a while. But yeah, I mean, that's another aspect to look at, getting inside your foot in the door.
For state, actually, the only real requirement to take the Foreign Service exam is that you be 20 years old or older, between 20 and 59. So we actually don't have a degree requirement to take the Foreign Service exam. That being said, once you get past the multiple choice exam of the State Department, the competitive piece of it is being able to articulate your experiences and motivations to be a Foreign Service officer, sort of drawing on your professional or academic experience. So meaning that folks with more work experience under their belt, or Peace Corps, for example, private sector experience, have just more professional experience to draw from when framing sort of examples of how you've demonstrated leadership or communication, or sort of cross-cultural adaptability, et cetera. But the median age of the sort of successful exam takers, 31, with a master's degree. That's sort of, but there are folks that come in, take the exam as seniors in undergrad and pass. I've worked with colleagues like that, and also folks who are doing this as a second career. I came in with someone who was a state congressperson from Tennessee, and was doing this, as a second career, because he wanted to show his children the world, and so he did it as a second career. So there's a little bit of everything. Yeah.
Oh, that's great. Okay, now this is in my view the best question. Okay, what are the myths versus the realities of your job? And Anna, I'm going to have you start.
Should I start with the positive myths or the negative myths? So, there have been many television shows. The most recent of them is the House of Cards, where I don't want to ruin it for anyone who hasn't gotten to season 3, but one of the characters plays a very senior State Department official, and so kind of giving you all this nitty-gritty of like backroom negotiations and all kinds of diplomacy. And so that's definitely not a myth. We are engaging diplomatically, and some of that involves some very exciting, interesting, fascinating, moments throughout the course of your career, but it's not all like that, obviously. We are a large federal bureaucracy, so there's a lot of drafting of papers and sort of, bureaucratic wrangling and debate that goes on as we sort of hash out a consensus internal position on whatever that policy, process might be. So there's the sort of exciting piece of it you see on TV, and then there's the sort of reality of getting to that, negotiating position. So one of the negative myths I've heard a lot in this job is that people think that, the second that you're accepted into the Foreign Service, you're going to be deployed to a war zone. And that is not true. These positions in conflict areas are filled on a volunteer basis, and certainly are not being filled with any longer with first tour officers. So don't worry. And the other sort of myth, which is a corollary to that, which is that you have zero sort of choice or input into your assignments. And so just to explain how the process works a bit, as an entry-level officer, so let's say you pass through that entire process I described earlier, the exam process, and you arrive bright-eyed and bushy-tailed to your orientation class, ready to go. You actually receive a list of entry-level positions, and you pick your top choices. So let's say 20. You pick your top 20. You sort of need to be ready, willing, and available to go to any of those top choices. And then you speak with your career development officer, so sort of your career counselor, and you explain the logic or narrative of why you've chosen these jobs, whether it's sort of, personal interest or because, your spouse can work in, certain countries, et cetera. And then your career counselor and the other career counselors, everybody else's counselors, sort of hash it out in this process. And then they come back to you with sort of your assignment. And obviously trying to take into account your preferences and reasons, but at the end of the day, you do commit to being worldwide available when you take on the career. So, but then once you are tenured and you sort of move on to the mid-level, it is entirely sort of your decision-making process to manage your career and choose and compete for your assignments in an internal, what we call bidding or application process.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
John, do you have any myths or?
So one myth that I mentioned already is that there's a misconception that we're a federal agency in the executive branch, which, as I explained, we're not. And so when people hear federal, they think that we're an agency, which is not true. And when people hear Federal Reserve Bank, they think, okay, well then they must be an investment bank. And so we're not a for-profit private sector investment bank. The Federal Reserve System has this unique role as central bank of the United States. And so our commitment is to policy making, but we exist in this different legal structure within the government. So those are two misconceptions, either that we're a bank or that we're part of the executive branch.
So I can't deposit my money with you right now.
You cannot.
Okay. Oh well.
Put that check away.
Yes.
But banks in which you deposit your money deposit reserves at the Federal Reserve. So the financial system is interlinked in that way.
And safe.
And safe.
Okay.
Yes.
Sam, you have any?
So, working with the intelligence community, there's a lot of myths out there. People think you're going to be James Bond and all this stuff, and that's just
And
not
your
true.
martinis.
Jason
my
Bourne's
martinis,
born
Jason
identity. And
You're not going to be Jason Bourne's. It doesn't work like that. There's a lot of hard work required. There's paperwork, of course, just like any other corporate job. But at the same time, what's required in the early years is extensive training, tradecraft, learning the tradecraft of analysis, of operations. And one cannot just simply walk into operations. That does not happen. It happens over time after numerous performance reviews are conducted on your current activities that you're assigned to. Now, if you are a STEM major, of course you will be in a scientific related position where you're studying weapons of mass destruction capabilities of different countries around the world through emerging technologies that are, that China is developing, or Iran, or any of these hotspots. So training is key, and that will happen for your first 2 to 3 years. And after that, with DoD or even the agencies, you will be posted overseas if you choose, if there is a requirement for your skill set. So you'll be housed in an embassy, and you have to be ready and willing to deploy for some extended period of time. But I like to stress that it's hard work. It's a process of building your name and establishing your reputation within your community, within your division or your department. And individuals that take on more responsibilities are rewarded afterwards with, better positions.
More responsibility.
More responsibilities, sure. And but at the same time, I lived in a mud hut for 2 years. It was one of those things that I just had to suck it up and do it. And it was tough. It was tough. Going from normal city life and living in a mud hut and sleeping in a tent for a while. So it was tough. But you know what? I got used to it. I adapted because the mission was the utmost important thing that mattered at the time. And you have to be able to adapt. That's what I like to tell people, especially in the first few years. There will be times of frustration, but you have to adapt and be in sync with your current team. So.
But that's a good lead into the next question, which is what are the characteristics of people who tend to do well
Yep.
and are happy in the profession? So
Sure.
adaptation.
Adaptation is key. Adaptation is key, and being able to work with difficult personalities. You're going to be working with individuals that are with various age range. You're going to have 25-year-old to 60 years old. So you have to really understand and work with people. That's very key. And people that are really happy in their jobs are, taking it one day at a time in a way, and looking at the grand picture of what they're doing, what their position is doing, and how it's contributing to U.S. foreign policy or defense policy, and how their input is making that difference at the end of the day. I mean, public service is a privilege in a way. You are making things better for the greater good of the nation. And some people who are unhappy, they forget that. And that's very unfortunate. They forget that. And, but at the same time, adapting to your environment is also very key.
And would you say the same for foreign service officers?
I mean, I would say that
Like tact should be the number one.
tact is important for diplomats. But I often start this conversation by describing to people a bit like the lifestyle, right? So you go overseas, you are the face of the United States. So everything you say, especially if you're sort of in a smaller, environment or city or post, everything you say, everything you do, I mean, you are speaking for the United States and representing the United States. You are in a position, for 2 to 3 years, and then, you're moving from country to country.
Yeah.
So you're packing it up, saying goodbye to, the friends that you've made, and transitioning to a new job, starting all over again, learning a whole new skill set. And in that process, as you spend, these years traveling with some stints back in Washington, D.C., life moves on in the U.S., right? Friends and family have milestones in their lives, people get older, and you sort of, you dip in and out of it, but your career, you've chosen sort of a lifestyle of service overseas. And so what I often say to people is, if you're listening to that and that excites you, if that sounds like, wow, that's interesting, that's something that's kind of a challenge or a lifestyle I'd love to take on, then, more likely than not, you would be sort of happy doing this. But for some people, that may not be how they want to spend their professional career, or they may want to do it for a certain time, but not for the span of an entire career.
Okay, hold that thought, because we're getting to the bad
Yeah.
people who cannot survive.
Yeah.
anymore.
So I think if that sort of if that appeals, then you would be happy doing it.
Okay. So John, who'd be happy at the Fed?
So I would echo two things that Sam and Anna said, those being teamwork and flexibility. But in contrast to these jobs that they've described with very demanding overseas deployments, your work at the Fed would be domestic, so you wouldn't have that kind of volatility. Instead, what I think makes people happy and successful and really thrive at the Fed is really a deep intellectual curiosity about financial markets and the economy, because at the Fed you have really an unlimited opportunities to read and digest data and research, and your job is to be well informed and conducting insightful analyses. So if you're someone who's very passionate about learning new things about financial markets and the economy, thinking about how they intersect, then I think you'll do well. The more analytical skills, the better. So if you're comfortable at an intermediate economics course level at Yale, that's probably adequate. But the more you like analyzing data and also being able to communicate it clearly and writing about it clearly are very valuable skills also.
Okay, and how about someone who would be very unhappy at the Fed? What are those characteristics?
So I really haven't met anyone who's truly unhappy, but I think that people who are not interested in working with numbers would be frustrated, as well as people who want to analyze financial markets for the purposes of making as much money as soon as possible by investing based on those investment ideas. You know, we analyze financial markets as closely as anyone else in the world, I think, but we're analyzing them for a policy purpose. If you have a great insight about what you think markets will do, your job is to understand that and brief policymakers about that, not to trade for your own profit. And we have restrictions in place to prevent those conflicts of interest. But if it's someone who wants to think about financial markets, but with a policy purpose, I think they will be successful and happy at the Fed.
Okay, and Anna, the people who would be, the characteristics of people who would be unhappy as a Foreign Service officer.
Well, I mean, I think it's the flip side of the coin, right? So if the idea of, always feeling like you're representing, the U.S. government with sort of, everything that you say, overseas. So it's almost being in this spotlight. I mean, there are times where, you will be, out and about and it's just sort of you hanging out, but then all of a sudden a conversation starts and it's very clear you are the U.S. Embassy. You are the U.S. Embassy person at the cafe. So that's hard. I mean, you definitely, when you come back to the United States, you're more anonymous. You're just one other person on the metro in D.C., right? But overseas, that can be a pressure over time.
You're the U.S. government 24/7.
Yes.
When you're overseas.
Absolutely. And like Sam, I served in Baghdad for a year, and it's very possible that at some other point in my career I will go back to a conflict zone or a danger zone, and for a year I lived in a trailer, in a dusty trailer in Baghdad. I mean, the housing is different there now. But I think that a lot of times you are called upon to sort of make sacrifices in your personal life, to sort of step up and when you're sort of called on to serve, and so I think that if that's something that appeals, again, you will be happy or find ways to find that balance as you're doing it. But that definitely has to be something that you want to do. So I mean, there are many different types of personalities in the Foreign Service who are happy, introverts, extroverts, or I don't know what the term is for folks who are in the middle, or but I think the idea of moving around, of being in the spotlight, and of sort of committing to being worldwide available, it's not for everybody, obviously.
And I agree, and I think that changes. If you're in your 20s and if you get married, especially when you're a family, I think that causes, it changes the dynamic a little bit. So the lifestyle I see is the number one, factor in people's unhappiness if they're being told to deploy, and especially if the nation's at wartime, that puts a lot of pressure. Everyone in the federal government, from state to everything. So lifestyle is a big factor in determining how you want to adapt. So what I see is individuals that after they have families and with kids and stuff, they tend to scale back their role in a way. Or they may, pick up a second career or anything we're going to get into. But that just happens over time. So I think in your 20s, if you're single, and you want to move around the world and see every place, that, it's just an amazing place to be, whether it be state or DoD.
So you have a family now, and you want to get out of the DoD. What do you do?
I mean, with a growing defense, specter, I would like to say, in Washington, there are numerous companies that are still consulting with defense, providing services to base operations overseas, even international relations analysis that are happening, but happening from a private perspective. where you have think tanks providing their input, and also these big integrators, technology integrators that are in Washington. So that is usually the next stop for individuals that are trying to come out, want to remain in the DC metro area. They usually get a position as a program manager or a consultant, still managing those specific programs like a USAID, where they're working with establishing that public-private relationship and expanding the state's mission or the DoD's mission by cutting the red tape in a way, where they can, get into a country without the baggage, in a way, of the process that it takes to get approvals to mobilize, forces to be in a remote location. So yeah, that's usually the next stop.
And Anna, who have you seen? What's the exit strategies for people in foreign service, or are they all lifers?
No. So I think in general, the international affairs career path has really evolved, generation to generation. So it used to be that there were very few games in town, if
Right.
you wanted to do foreign policy or diplomacy. And now it's just about, checking in with yourself in that process of self-clarification and thinking, which angle of it, do I want to work on? So government, nonprofit, multilateral, think tank, private sector, a startup, start your own thing. It's a question of, size, resources, and sort of, evaluating your own strengths and thinking, or where you are in your life, and just sort of thinking, what would be the best use of my talents, right now. And so you see people, transition out of the State Department, whether civil service or foreign service. So let's say, for example, you have a full career, and then you retire. People teach. They work at think tanks whose consultants are, or strategy firms whose clients are, foreign governments, or even the U.S. Government. So doing similar work, but just from the other side of it, from the outside, looking in. Or folks will transition from working in government to, doing nonprofit, to doing advocacy, to doing private sector. So I think Washington, D.C. Is a very small world.
Right.
And you definitely bank on the reputation that you develop in one organization to sort of help thrust you toward the next step. And so, it might be that going in, you only want to, work with a certain organization for a certain number of years, or you may decide that after however many years, okay, I'd like to try something different. And so you start the process of, networking and asking around and kind of shopping around your resume. So for everyone, it's different, but I would say that within these circles, for example, whether it's related to a certain region or a certain functional expertise, like multilateral issues, people all sort of know one another, and it really is based on what we call your corridor reputation, and folks saying, oh, you're interested in making a change, well, we're looking to hire this type of a person, so.
Okay. And John, how about with people from the Fed?
Sure. So actually, a pretty fair number of people who work with me have pretty long tenures at the Fed, but for those who leave, the most common two paths to where they go for their next steps are either a different policy-making job in a federal agency like the Treasury or other economic policy organization, or they go to the private sector and work for an investment fund or investment bank because they have a strong training in both policy and financial market analysis. Both the policy and the financial market track are very available to them. But some people have left to do very random things like healthcare startups. So I don't think you're pigeonholed in one very narrow career path because you have a strong foundation across a couple of areas. For the straight out of college analyst programs, mostly they'll leave after a few years and go on to a graduate degree, either a master's or a PhD. And for those that get PhDs who have done the research analyst track, working for an economist, a lot of them will go into academia. But the ones who have worked in my department who go on to get MBAs or masters in public policy will go back to the Fed or go to the private sector or another international agency or government division.
Okay. Well, I think that covers the questions. So now we'll take questions from the audience and from the web, if I can figure out how to work this. But I'd like to thank the panelists first, John, Anna, and Sam, for being here. Thank you so much.
Thank
for
you.
the
It's
information.
been a pleasure.
Yeah.
So any questions?
I have a question for Ms. Escudilla. So you mentioned that the date to take the foreign service exam is mid to late April?
For registration. So
Registration.
yeah, the exam is in June. And so what you would want to do is go on the careers website, and there's a whole sort of section about the exam. You can find out how to download a study guide. And we also have an app called DOS Careers, where you can download it for free, and we have a whole bunch of practice questions that you can use. So you would register for the exam mid to late April, and the website will let you know when, if you use the Keep Me Informed function, the website will let you know when registration opens so that you can go on there and sort of select your slot. But the exam is offered in June, October, and February, so pretty much quarterly.
And then what is the rest of the timeline after that? So say if I took it in June,
Yeah.
how long does the rest of that process take?
So are you a senior now?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, so within, if you take it in June, and then you would find out if you passed about 3 weeks later, and then you would submit your essay, and then you would find out about a month after that if you had been invited to do the oral assessment, which you have sort of latitude in terms of scheduling when you want to do that, and then after you take the exam, let's say you pass the oral exam, then medical and security clearances are individual. It just depends on the individual. But we tell people sort of the average time is about 18 months. So you definitely want to be doing something else while you're doing this.
So you should find a job before you get your job.
Well, I mean, unless you, yes, you should find a job unless you can just hang out. So yeah.
Go ahead.
So a lot of you spoke about the difficulty of having a lifestyle where you're traveling constantly, moving around. So I was wondering if there are any types of careers in the government you'd recommend, and like specifically like intelligence, State Department type of skill set that allow you to stay in the U.S.
Yeah, I mean, we have an entire civil service that is both Washington, D.C. based, and then, in our various diplomatic security and passport offices across the United States. For the State Department, that is entirely domestic. So for the civil service, if you were planning on going to graduate school, you could look at the Presidential Management Fellowship Program, and then also just go on USA Jobs and apply for civil service jobs that way. We also have a program called state has a program called the Recent Graduates Program, where 1 year after you graduate, you have to have your diploma to be eligible, but 1 year after you graduate, you are eligible for a full-time paid position with the State Department. So again, it's about going on our careers website and having it give you a heads up when vacancies have opened under the Recent Graduates Program. The other thing I want to flag as well is we have internships both in Washington, D.C. and in our over 250 embassies and consulates. So I often encourage people who are sort of interested, flirting with the idea, but not so sure, to consider an overseas internship as a way to kind of get that initial exposure and decide if it's something that you'd like to do. So.
I have a question for all of you. First of all, what was your first job out of college? And second of all, if you didn't work in the government, but you could imagine another job where your skill set would apply and you would excel, what would that be?
It's a great question.
Great question.
I'll let Sam answer.
So I was, my first job was a advisor for the intel community and the DoD in Afghanistan, right after 9/11 or so. And, but I was doing various things, and a lot of it was classified information. But what I would be doing if I didn't go that path was most likely, I'm from Texas, so it was going to be in the oil services business. I'll probably work for Exxon for a long time or so, and see the world from that angle. But after 9/11, everything just changed in a way, and I had the specific languages that were required. at that time. So, that's how I was recruited into the federal services and the Intel arena. But so that's what I would be doing.
So I went straight to grad school after undergrad. I'm not a Yale. I went to undergrad at Brown.
That's okay.
And my secret's out. And I did my master's at Columbia at the School of International Public Affairs, SIPA, and then went right into the State Department after that. But I think if I hadn't done state, I was actually looking at going to law school because it just seemed like a good, appropriate thing to do after undergrad. It was just something like I would like to go to law school, but I didn't exactly know if I wanted to be a lawyer. But I became interested in international relations, and I just I knew that my dad was going to say, "That's really interesting, but what are you going to do with that?" And so State Department was like, federal career with pension and benefits and things that my parents were really worried about, but I wasn't so much, at the time. But I think probably, maybe humanitarian, international organizations, NGO, possibly consulting, international consulting as well.
Okay.
But just a way to I definitely wanted practical, hands-on international experience. So I think any sort of field that would have enabled me to kind of get out into the field, particularly in the Middle East, which was where I was interested in being, would have appealed. Mm-hmm. So, yeah. I think also at some point, after I retire or sort of working it into my career as well, I love teaching. So I think I would like to sort of teach international relations as well.
John, what about you?
So my first job right out of college was I worked for an economic consulting firm that hired me through Yale on-campus recruiting as a senior, and I did that for approximately a year, doing statistical analysis for this consulting firm that had provided expert witness services for litigation. So when an antitrust or securities class action lawsuit occurs, there's this consulting firm that helps to assess damages using statistical work. So I thought that would be a good stepping point into either academic research or financial market private sector work. And I found that I actually liked the financial market private sector work more after that job, so I moved into municipal finance, where I realized that I liked financial market work, but also a policy angle on it. So that was my transition initially in this direction. And after business school, I landed at the Fed, which was, I think, a great fit for me. If I hadn't been at the Fed, I think I would have really liked to find either a government entity that could make use of someone with a good understanding of financial markets and how they work, or any other organization where I could use economic analysis and financial market research for something with a socially beneficial purpose.
Thank you.
Yes, way back.
I have a question about the PMF. The PMF. I've just been hearing that in recent years it isn't guaranteed that you'll get a job, and I just was curious if you could just tell us has it actually changed, or is it?
It's not. No, a job is not guaranteed. If you make it to be a semifinalist, you're not guaranteed a job. You then go on to this, massive federal government-wide career fair, where then you are working, sort of engaging with all the different federal agencies who are hiring PMFers. So then you do need to secure a position with a home agency. So once you have, then you can, secure your rotations with other agencies. But yeah, no, the position's not guaranteed. If you make it as a semifinalist, you do have to get hired on by a federal agency, and all the different federal agencies have different sort of rules and budget constraints about how they bring on PMFers. So State Department is a major consumer of PMFers, although by no means the only consumer, and many PMFers do want to be consumed or hired by the State Department, but it's
Yes.
I was wondering about y'all could quickly describe your typical workday, most average workday, just because I'm still kind of confused what you do. Yeah.
Sure. An average workday, I might arrive a little before 8 in the morning. We have, shortly after I arrive, a big group meeting where we discuss what's been going on overnight in European and Asian financial markets and our outlook for what's happening in markets for the day ahead.
This is just the markets group you're
In the
talking
markets
about.
group, yeah,
Okay.
this is my typical day. Then I'll usually make sure I'm up to speed on what's in financial news, either in normal news periodicals or in financial research that investment banks and private firms are putting out about economic conditions and financial markets. I'll usually have a responsibility on one of our open market operations to buy mortgage-backed securities. So we have an array of responsibilities with operations, and then after that, I may return to some longer-term analytical research project where maybe I'm writing an internal memo about some statistical analysis I'm doing of market conditions. But no day is really totally typical. Sometimes, a couple times a month, I have a shift where I come in at 4 in the morning and analyze Asian and European markets. So then that's not quite the lifestyle volatility of someone who's stationed in Iraq, but that's the sort of volatile working conditions that we have at the Fed, where you get into the work at 4 in the morning, talk to people in Asia about what's happening in financial markets, talk to people in Europe about what's happening in markets, and brief the policymakers first thing when they get to work.
It's funny because there's so many interesting parallels. You know, in the policy world, information is at a premium, and so your greatest value add in the organization is sort of being smart about what's happening in the world. And so usually your day will start, you know, my job as a recruiter, as a diplomat in residence is pretty atypical, so I'm gonna talk about what you would do at a US embassy overseas, or even a Washington policy office. So whether you're in Bujumbura or Caracas or Washington DC or Bucharest, your day starts by sort of consuming, you know, your sort of local and you know, international news to kind of glean if there's anything that affects you in the particular space you're working in, or sort of US policy interests generally. Usually there will be like a morning meeting, whether within your section, or the ambassador will call what's called the country team. So the heads of all the different sections. We have economic, political, cultural, press, management, and consular, and sort of, you know, have everyone go around and brief her about what's going on in the country, what's going on that day, what should the ambassador be focused on, you know, what meetings are going on, what issues are brewing, what is going on in Washington, you know, what is Washington gonna bother us about today, you know? And the same process is happening in Washington as well. You know, all the heads of the various bureaus are having offices where policy desk officers are sort of feeding information up to the chain, and then these you know, senior officers then meet with the Secretary of State, you know, when he's in town, or the Deputy Secretary, to sort of brief the information up. And then at that point, we're moving forward policy goals, or sort of reacting to events on the ground. So, you know, as a political officer myself, that means, I mean, it's very important that you're out and about meeting people, building relationships, you know, depending on what we call your portfolio, so the issues that you're responsible for. You know, as an economic officer, you would be meeting with, you know, local business officials, banking officials, folks in the various, you know, ministries concerned with economics, to sort of find out what's going on, what are trends in the economy, what are issues that could affect U.S. business. And so think about that from the political perspective and from the press and cultural perspective as well. I mean, embassy officials are sort of, we're almost like journalists, you know, we're out and about, you know, meeting people, finding out what's going on, except the public, when we come back to our office and we write our cables and analysis about what's happening to sort of keep Washington informed, the public isn't reading, you know, what we're writing, because it's kind of in an internal system. But we're not just witnessing and writing events, we are, you know, engaging and delivering U.S. policy messages to try to sort of influence outcomes that are, you know, in U.S. foreign policy interests. So it's almost this back and forth, like we're getting information and sharing it, but we're also engaging. So I think that the ideal balance is sort of half your time out, you know, sort of understanding what's happening in the country, and then half your time in, you know, doing your paperwork, doing your reports, doing your writing. A good Foreign Service officer, I think, you know, people who do well in the Foreign Service are people who can write well, quickly, who can brief. You know, you're in the elevator with the ambassador, you know, he's about to go into a meeting, and he'll turn to you and say, what are the 3 things I need to get done at this meeting? if you don't have the answer to that question, the ambassador is not going to be happy. I mean, you sort of need to be that issue expert. So folks who do well in the Foreign Service are folks who can kind of manage that, pressure and sort of understand what's expected of them, and deliver, even in any kind of situation, whether it's under pressure or in a crisis. So.
Well, I think we are at our time limit. Sorry, Sam, you didn't get to answer.
Sorry, I did go
But
on.
if you all would like to join us, Sam has reserved the Swiss Room at Berkeley for dinner. So you can come and talk to us individually or at dinner. So
Sure.
please, join us there. I'd also like to remind you that on April 21st, we have another panel on the internet and data services. So I hope you can sign up for that when you get the notice. But thank you for coming, and we appreciate your attention. Thanks.
Thank you.